This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Kind of you. It was thank you very much. Now, this is my title. The title that was on the seminar programme, Autour de sa livre, about her book, it turned out to be something I just couldn't write about, not a title at all. And also, I have to explain that there's a diffidence that was inculcated in me a long time ago to do with speaking about work that's already been published. I was brought up to think that this is a very bad thing to do. Once you've published it, it's over. You don't talk about it again. So that idea is deeply ingrained in me. So I changed the title to Autour d'un écrivain, writing about a writer. I'll be talking, as Fabrice told you, about Joseph Woolley, the Nottinghamshire framework knitter. There is a knitter at his knitting frame. The local magistrate, Sir Joseph Woolley, the writing of both of them, and then the book that came out of my reading of their writing, and also one last little stray thing left over from my long years with Joseph Woolley that I just have to pursue, that I'm pursuing right now. And I intend to conclude with an account of the research and writing decisions that mean you end up with this book and not some other kind of book, not some other kind of account of the stocking maker, the magistrate, and the law. Anyway, Joseph Woolley, as Fabrice told you, is at the centre of an everyday life of the English working class. Oh, look, some pictures of stocking frames from the later century, and so vocabulary to do with framework knitting. He lived in the village of Clifton. This is very confusing because the village, of course, being on the Clifton estates, shares the same name with the magistrate. So I'm sometimes talking about the village of Clifton, and I'm sometimes talking about Sir Gervase Clifton, which says everything really about the system of English land holding in the 18th and 19th century. Clifton is about 3 miles south of Nottingham. I haven't got a pointer, but there's a very beautiful contemporary map. You can probably see Clifton there, 3 miles south of the county town of Nottingham. And Joseph Woolley's dates were round about 1769 to 1850. He lived a very long time. I came across his diaries. It must have been in 2008. Some of you heard this story this morning. By then, I had already spent a very long time in Nottinghamshire Archives, Nottinghamshire County Record Office, because I used what are called the justicing notebooks of magistrate and landowner Sir Gervase Clifton. I used them. This is just one page from the 2 volumes of notes he kept about his work as a magistrate. I used them for my book Labour's Lost, Domestic Service and the Making of Modern England. Sir Gervase Clifton, you probably can't read that, made records of his justicing room business between about 1770 and 1815. And these included his adjudication of domestic service disputes, quarrels between masters and mistresses and servants from all across the Clifton estates. In fact, the whole of Rushcliffe 100 is really the Clifton estate, and beyond. Now, magistrates were not actually empowered in law to deal with domestic labour. They were permitted to deal with farm labour, agricultural labour, but they did it every day. They just believed the legal fiction that all servants were farm servants, so they could deal with them. And along with the records of another magistrate from Shropshire, Sir Gervase's notebooks allowed me to explore the legal regulation of domestic service and servants' own very canny understanding of the law and legal thinking that governed their working life. So in 2008, I knew one Clifton village man's official writing very well indeed. And I was in the last stages of writing Labour's Lost. I had to go back to Nottingham to check something or other, I can't remember what. And whilst waiting for my documents to arrive, I did something that I always tell my PhD students to do. I used to say, when you're hanging around waiting for the documents to arrive, check the card catalogue under the index for diaries. You never know what you might find. And what I found was Clifton, Diaries of Joseph Woolley, framework knitter for 1801, 03, 04, 09, 1813, 1815. And I sent for them. Now, what I was after in my very first scan through, that's a page from them, were of course references to Sir Gervase Clifton and his activities as a magistrate and landlord, and there were a great many of them. I had in fact found two men from the opposite ends of the social spectrum writing in very close proximity to each other during 6 years at the beginning of the 19th century. Both the magistrate and the stockingmaker recorded the early 19th century every day, but from rather different perspectives. What struck me immediately back in 2008 was how very aware Joseph Woolley was of what went on in Sir Gervase's justicing room. He recorded many incidents that took place. Most magistrates set aside a room in their house which was called the justicing parlour or the justicing room, in which they heard local people with complaints. So Woolley recorded many incidents that Sir Gervase was involved in that the magistrate himself did not record. So in fact Joseph Woolley's diaries are a much better record, as Fabrice mentioned. And what also struck me back in 2008, and this was a very quick read through, was Joseph Woolley's familiarity with the language of the law and with legal proceedings. He took for granted that his friends, neighbours and family had the same level of legal consciousness. Legal phrases and formularies structured the stories he told, his character assessments, and I believe his way of seeing the world. His diaries demonstrate that in Clifton Village and all across the Clifton estates, ordinary people talked law to each other. They took the disputes and antagonisms of everyday life to the magistrate and talked law to him, the magistrate. Some of them constructed personal histories in the light of the law they knew, in order to have the magistrate put into effect, the law into effect on their behalf. They told stories about themselves as a particular kind of legal person. I am a poor woman without the means of subsistence, or in the language of the statutes, I am a poor impotent woman without the means to care for my child, though she may not have been at all. And Woolley reports this kind of law talk in his diaries, and there's much corroboratory evidence of law talk in the magistrate's notebooks. And the framework knitter's diaries suggest that law experience was worked over, expanded and consolidated in everyday conversations between family members, friends, neighbours and lovers, and in the altercations and alehouse quarrels that Woolley spent so much time reporting. Reading Woolley's stories of drunken nights out and alehouse trashing is very much like reading the valiant attempts of the magistrate to write down what deponents and witnesses said to him in his parlour, who proposed the fight, who delivered the first blow, which woman first called another a dirty, stinking bitch in the harvest field. Now, why were Woolley's diaries not known? Why were these documents not more widely known? At the time, in 2008, I speculated that their deposition in the early 1990s had a lot to do with it. That was a period when, in Britain, academic interest in labour and working class history was on the wane under the sway of the cultural and linguistic turn. And also, I still think this, they really are a little indelicate. Joseph Woolley spent many of the 100,000 words he wrote discoursing upon the sex life of his friends and neighbours in graphic detail. And of course, they had been paid attention. Local history groups, genealogists and historians of the hosiery and knitwear industry had consulted them. Transcriptions had been started, then abandoned. Perhaps the diary's indecency in some parts halted some transcribers. Perhaps, if you are a social historian of the Nottinghamshire hosiery trade in the era of Luddism, a working man who lived through those years of crisis and rebellion, and yet who never once mentions Ned Ludd, gives you pause. Here is my favourite and beautiful reference to Ned Ludd, my cross-dressing hero, the leader of the Luddites. Anyway, a diary for 1812, which was the peak year of the Nottinghamshire crisis, was either never produced or it was lost along the way of 200 years. I actually think the latter. There are internal references in all the diaries that suggest that Woolley did write during the years for which there are no extant diaries, and that he wrote earlier than 1801. But anyway, to go back to the question of why they had not been exploited, if you were a labour or social historian, you might not know what to do with a worker who did not appear to match the prototype inscribed by E.P. Thompson in The Making of the English Working Class. Now, I'm not saying in some superior kind of way that I did know what to do with Joseph Woolley, but I think this shows that I really did try to do something. And I'll talk about why I tried in the way I did and not in some other way. We have choices as readers, mediators and presenters of other people's writing, and I will explain towards the end how I perceive my choices and how ultimately I came to think of Woolley as a writer above all the other things he was: man, working man, framework knitter, brother, son. I came to think of him as a writer, of that as his primary identity. By the way, do you know about the fabulous Luddite Bicentenary website? Every day this website charts what was happening during the Luddite rebellion 200 years ago, to the very day, sometimes to the very hour. So at the moment, the crisis has moved up north from Nottinghamshire through Derbyshire into Yorkshire, and it's just crossing over into the Lancashire territories. It's wonderful to watch it enacted before your eyes, day by day. So you can find it at that I'm just looking, that's it. Now, Joseph Woolley did not call his 6 notebooks diaries. He didn't call them diaries. It's not a word he ever uses. That's how an anonymous cataloguer described them 20 years ago. He called them his memorandums. Joseph Woolley, his memorandums for the year 1804, for example. And he did not often make daily entries, which diary theorists consider to be the mark of a diary. He either wrote up events of the past week when he did his accounts, or of the past year at the beginning of the new year. He appears never once to have written between a Tuesday and a Saturday in any one week. For he was a stocking maker working a very intense 4-day week in a putting out system. He was a worker who kept St. Monday, though he didn't call it that, and he always kept the first Saturday night of every month free for the meeting of his friendly society at the Red Hart Inn in neighbouring Ruddington. Ruddington is about 15 minutes walk from Clifton, and it's very important to note that Ruddington was a free or open village outside the Clifton estates. That's why his friendly society met there. And about a third of his 100,000 words are actually numerals. I believe that his narrative writing originated in the practice of recording incomings and outgoings weekly and then summarily annually. And what this means is that we end up with an extraordinarily detailed account of one unmarried working man's getting and spending. Now, this was voluntary record keeping of his own financial activity and his own money, and given the fluctuating income provided by stocking making, he was very, very wise to keep these records. In 1812, the House of Commons Select Committee on the Framework Knitters' petitions heard from several Nottingham stockingers about dishonourable manufacturers who took advantage of a framework knitter's anxiety when he brought in the finished stockings, flashing before the worker his name with some figures at the end of it in a book. And as they said, the workman must either be distressed for the money which is owing or take work out at an abated price. And John Blackner, who was both a framework knitter himself and a historian of Nottinghamshire, thought that many hosiers, merchant manufacturers, used bookkeeping as a form of power. But Joseph Woolley never noted prices agreed with a master or a hosier. He did record what he had received for the finished goods with the formula work came to. That was in 1801, or later in his career with 2 pair of maid's hose shapes, 4 shillings and 4pence. That's young girls' stockings. That was from 1815. So like the majority of his colleagues, he relied on memory and the honesty of the hosier for fulfilment of their agreement. In 1812, the major plea of Nottinghamshire framework knitters was for a published, or at least a prominently displayed, schedule of prices to be paid for different types of stocking, and all manufacturers objected to this proposal, claiming that it would increase their bookkeeping and office expenses. Just couldn't do it. You know, it would cost too much. The men would suffer in the end. These were the reasons they gave to the House of Commons Select Committee. Woolley recorded nothing until it was in the past and done. Money received, money spent. He used much more ink recording his outgoings, what he spent money on, than he did on recording incomings. And he always recorded monthly expenditure first, followed by income. He spent and wrote about spending, and then he briefly recorded what had come in that month. Now, these are really rare and valuable accounts. But because he was an unmarried man living at home with his parents during the diary-keeping years, we do not have a record of his shopping for food and no record of what he ate, except for the odd food treat like oranges or buns. He used to buy oranges when he was shaved every Saturday at the barber's, and bought, treat food, buns, queen cakes, fresh herrings, when they were available, presumably when they were being hawked in the streets. Now, this is by way of striking contrast with his expenditure on drink. You can work out, as I did, a detailed cost sheet for the booze he consumed. An awful lot of it, but never on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday or Friday. His being single was important for the way in which I read and wrote up the diaries. Now, in the book, I discuss his single state by reference to the birth order of the Woolley siblings, the death of his older half-brother Edward, which made him the eldest son, the extraordinary longevity of his parents and their dependence on him, and the very great changes taking place in stocking manufacture during these years, and also the particularity of tenantry on Sir Gervase Clifton's land. And, of course, I discuss the sexual conventions of the time. I quote the demographers who tell us that about 4 in 10 late 18th century English people never married, fell into the category of never married. Slightly more women than men never married, but it's still a calculation that shows Woolley to be really not unusual among his peers. Demographers usually discuss these men and women as celibate. Woolley would have had a laugh at that. That's the point of my chapter in the book called Sex and the Single Man. You may know what that's an allusion to. I can tell you, Sex and the Single Man. So many of our assumptions about life and labour in the working class past are bound up, at least they are in Britain, with the idea of the family wage and the male breadwinner. But Joseph Woolley can help restore the never married man to the historical record. Now, his words and his numerals were distributed, as you can see, across 6 Old Moors almanacs. Are those the only 2 I brought with me? Oh no. 6 Old Moors almanacs bound with interleaved blank pages. The almanac notebooks are, the 6 of them aren't identical in format, but the usual dimensions were 15 by 10 by 5 centimetres. Thickness depended on the number of blank writing sheets inserted. I have always assumed by a local printer bookseller, having bought the almanacs from London, unpick them, sew in blank sheets of paper and sell them locally. They were bound in embossed sheepskin, which was dyed either red or green. And these are not the most expensive notebooks Woolley could have bought, but they're certainly not the cheapest either. In January 1813, he paid for this book, the one he's actually writing in, 3 shillings, which was about 6% of his income for that month, which he calculated January 1813 at £2, 11 shillings and 4 pence. Now, because of the size of the page, the writing surface was cramped, but the diaries are really neat little articles, satisfying to hold and highly portable. You know, all this work that's going on men's legs and men's pockets by cultural and fashion historians. Well, these notebooks were held in Woolley's breeches pocket next to his upper thigh. They were literally pocket books. And they were practical, providing a weekly calendar, much account of the weather, past and predicted, and all things fitting for an almanac, as the byline said, including notable historical events and an enormous quantity of astronomical detail. They are almanacs, after all. Woolley's use of their layout was highly practical. His monetary accounts were written opposite the Old Moor calendar pages, and he began his narrative on the early blank pages, moving on to the end pages when he'd filled those up. But the end part of each notebook is also used for the annals of Clifton Village, births, fornications, deaths, and for his retrospective account of a particular year. And sometimes at the end he repeated stories from the earlier part of the year. Now, as he wrote, he really doesn't, on my reading, he really isn't in very much interaction with Old Moor. Indeed, for a reader of Woolley's knowledge and competence, Old Moor really must have been a bit of a joke. What he provided himself with was essentially a calendar in which he wrote his memorandums. It was what in the UK we now call a diary. I've got one in my handbag. In US English it's called a date book. His prose style was really not influenced by the hyperbolic predictions of Old Moor, and I'll come back to that point later. Now, I said just now that one point of origin for his act of writing was account keeping, but I also think that his detailed records of fornications, adulteries, marriages, births, deaths, and the churching of women had a similar practical origin. His father Samuel was parish clerk, one of the lay personnel of the Church of England, a job always given to humble men who could just about write. I think that Joseph helped his father out by recording this information for later writing up in the parish books, records of baptisms, churching of women, and so on. Now, of course, the fornications and adulteries were not needed by the parish clerk. That's rather a but there's a kind of sociological and writerly logic to including them. Once you've talked about the birth of children, you might want to record how they got to be children. And writerly logic. I conclude the book with the claim that Joseph Woolley was just that, a writer, and I use the term with the full cultural and aesthetic value that the 19th century English usage bestowed upon the word writer. And he was a reader. He bought and borrowed books and pamphlets and newspapers. He belonged to Sutton's Library in Nottingham, and there are enough references to Henry Fielding's Tom Jones in Woolley's notebooks to suggest that it shaped how he saw the world, maybe. Certainly to claim that Fielding was an influence on his prose style. With the reading material Woolley borrowed and bought, we have some evidence of what passed through his head. I think that is extraordinary. An extraordinary and rare access to a mind and sensibility in the past. And the story he tells of his own reading reveals the extraordinary vibrancy of Nottinghamshire print culture in the early 19th century. The highly literate context to Nottinghamshire Luddism, which is demonstrated by Kevin Binfield in his book Writings of the Luddites. That's about 5 years ago it was published. Kevin Binfield's work is given very sharp focus by Joseph Woolley. He didn't know about Joseph Woolley. On the evidence of his diaries, scarcely a day could have passed between 1800 and 1815 without Joseph Woolley reading something, not least his own writing. He had the habit of reading. He could evidently read easily and well. He expected to read. It was not an odd or intermittent activity. He was liberally provided with print. There were lending libraries, reading rooms, bookstalls and bookshops, all within walking distance, and he could afford to purchase a wide variety of print. His social circle gave him opportunities to discuss what he had read. And he may possibly have used a mail order service. On a page of notes written sometime in the spring of 1804 is scrawled in pencil, Lackington and Company, booksellers, Finsbury Square, London. Huge book emporium that distributed books across the United Kingdom. The career of Charles Sutton, who ran the circulating library, he was a Nottingham printer and bookseller, and some say he, Charles Sutton, was the first to name labour negotiations in the stocking trade as Luddism, the first to give a general feeling the name General Ludd. I make a lot of that in my last chapter. I think Charles Sutton deserves much fuller treatment than the couple of pages I devote to him in this book. I think there is a very fine PhD waiting there with Charles Sutton, bookseller of Nottingham. So, having told you this, these, as you could see from the contents page, are some of the headings under which I accounted for Joseph Woolley, for Sir Gervase Clifton, and the writing of both of them. And of course, here I cover over multiple absences. There's the absence of Luddism in Woolley's writing. Really, can you, as a historian, say anything at all, anything about the years 1811 to 1817 in Nottinghamshire without mentioning Luddism? I did, at the end, have a lot to say about Luddism, but some would say I worked too hard to write chapter 10, the knocking at the gate, General Ludd. There's the absence of Joseph Woolley as a worker, as an artisan or craft worker in a declining trade. The story the social historian has of these years is of a textile industry in long-term decline. What Joseph Woolley gives us is list after list of income and expenditure, of an ordinary life lived with some pleasure and some ease. Then there's the absence of the post-Thomsonian working-class hero. There are many silences to fill with the historian's busy storytelling. My storytelling here is very, very busy. I believe you have to try extraordinarily hard not to let your own storytelling get in the way of someone else's. You can't ignore what's there on the page. It has been deliberately recorded by another writer, who isn't you, who was Joseph Woolley. Money in and out, the frustration of dealing with a knitting frame that needs repairing, money earned not just from the exercise of labour in the stocking manufacture, but small-time trading in candles, garden produce bartered and sold, home doctoring and herbalism that provided a steady income stream for him from 1809 onwards. You have to see what's on the page. Drunk and amazingly drunk men and women. Woolley taking entirely for granted that women smoked and drank and got very pissed and took the sexual initiative over and over again. He records it because he thinks it's funny, not because he thinks it's unusual or wrong. So if I could just pause for a second and tell you what is left over for me after the book and what I have to pursue now and what then takes me back to Joseph Woolley. I've just finished an article with the title A Lawyer's Letter, Everyday Uses of the Law in Early 19th Century England. There are 3 lawyers' letters stories in Joseph Woolley's diaries. My first, not Joseph Woolley's first, but my first from 1803, when, I quote, Mr. Hopewell sent John Holt a lawyer's letter for the sum of money £7, 9 shillings and 9 pence, and they settled it on the 22nd of November. Now, John Holt was probably a yeoman framework knitter like Woolley, doing a bit of everything, including carrying and carting. He kept a few cows, as did Woolley's family. He threads his way through Woolley's diaries, drinking, fighting, gambling. Now, in that story, it's not the working man, John Holt, who paid for a lawyer's letter, but a man of more substance, Mr. Hopewell. It appears to have been one of those letters calling in debts which made up a good proportion of provincial attorney's office business. So Mr. Hopewell was not a poor ordinary user of the law, which is what I'm interested in. But Joseph Woolley heard about the letter, noted it as of interest, and knew exactly what kind of law was going on here. My second lawyer's letter, though the first to be told by Woolley, the second I'm telling here, is really much more interesting. Earlier in the year, January the 1st, 1803, or sometime thereabout, he wrote, Sal, Waldron and Barker fell out at Langford's. Langford's was the coach and horses public house named after the licensee John Langford. Sal Waldron and Barker fell out at Langford's, and he kicked her over the shins, and she went to Mr. Thompson for a warrant. That's another local magistrate. Sir Gervase must have been in London or in Bath. He wasn't at home. But his clerk would not let her see him, so she went to see a lawyer and got a lawyer's letter for him. Now, Sarah Waldron, Sal, short for Sarah Waldron, probably a stocking seamer, had a lot of trouble with William Barker, and he with her. She gave as good as she got. And a very long and salacious story about what happened the night he kicked her is told in several episodes throughout the 1803 volume. But then Woolley notes on the 8th of January that Sal Waldron and Barker make an end of their lawsuit, and Barker was obliged to own himself in a fault and pay all expenses and make her some recompense into the bargain. So Sal's lawyer's letter, which she paid for, was effective. And before obtaining it, she'd already tried the usual channels, going first to a local magistrate with the idea of a warrant for his arrest in mind. Mr. Thompson's clerk would not admit her. Then she went and paid for an attorney's letter. I would very, very much like to know how much Sal's letter cost her and how she could possibly afford one. That's my big puzzle, though I've managed to get over it. 3 shillings, 4 shillings it would have cost her in Birmingham in the 1790s. 5 shillings in Rugby in the 1820s for such a letter, asking your lawyer, your attorney, to write a letter to someone threatening them with legal proceedings unless they pay you money they owe or pay some recompense for damage they've done you. That's how much such a letter would cost you. In those other places I've managed to find records. Now, if she were a seamer, and I don't think there was anything else for women to do in Clifton except seam stockings, Sal Waldron earned perhaps 4 shillings a week. In May 1803, Woolley was paying his seamer, the woman who seamed his stocking shapes, 2 shillings and a penny, for doing 28 pairs. And then, so that's the second lawyer's letter. Then the last of Woolley's lawyer letter stories was told in February 1815. Now the legal process at work is much clearer to see in comparison with the letter stories from 12 years before, and it's easy to imagine people familiar with a kind of quasi-legal system. Indeed, to imagine that the lawyer's letter may have been seen as a system, as valid as anything else. Anyway, this is what Woolley wrote. Sometime in February, Joseph Cartwright had some of his hens and his cock poisoned by accident, and he, that's Cartwright, laid it to a person that did a neighbour's garden. And the man, being innocent, he sent them a lawyer's letter. And what happens next? Mr. and Mrs. Cartwright go straight to Sir Gervase Clifton. He's at home now. He's in his last dying days. He's ill. He's going to drop off his perch very soon. So he's not in Bath or in London. He's at home. So Mr. and Mrs. Cartwright go straight to the local magistrate with the letter in their hand. And Clifton grants them a warrant for the arrest of the gardener. And he arranges for 2 other local magistrates to be present when he hears the case, and his own attorney, William Jampson, to be present. The firm of Jampson and Leeson was a pretty big hitter in Nottingham, and scarcely a property deal in the county is arranged without it going through the firm of Jampson and Leeson, and James Jampson is Sir Gervase Clifton's own attorney. So he's bringing in the big guns. He usually hears cases alone. 2 other local magistrates and his own attorney. Cartwright and his wife swore that they saw the gardener lay the poison at 6 o'clock at night, and Sir Gervase committed him to prison, and he lay there till the Saturday following. Then, noted Woolley, it came out how the hens was poisoned. Another neighbour, a different neighbour, had laid ratsbane, that's poison against vermin. It's arsenic paste, spreading arsenic paste on stale bread and butter. Another neighbour, the rats hadn't gone for it, and it was swept up by his wife and put on the dunghill, where the hens fell on it with clucks of joy and immediately died. She remembered finally what she'd done, and the story was conveyed to Magistrate Clifton through 3 intermediaries. The truth came out, wrote Woolley. The man was set at liberty, and it is said that the Cartwrights had all the expenses to pay, and £3 3 shillings expenses for the time he laid in prison. And he continued, it cost the Cartwrights a great deal of money and served them right, for if they could have transported the man, they would have done. He also thought that the couple had been attempting to get neighbour Lambert, who employed the man, evicted from his tenancy held of Sir Gervase Clifton. You see, again, a day labourer employed as a gardener knew how to obtain the services of an attorney and had enough money to pay for them. He initiated legal proceedings, not by going to the magistrate, but by responding to the Cartwrights' accusations with a lawyer's letter. Only then did the Cartwrights access the official legal system. Now, why was Clifton reluctant to hear this case sitting alone. It wasn't that decision to have two other brother magistrates with him and his own attorney was not anything to do, I think, with the attorney's letter, but he was responding to an accusation of livestock poisoning, which is a serious property offence carrying the penalty of 7 years transportation beyond the seas. Anyway, what I've done in my just completed essay is attempt to add the lawyer's letter to the long list of types of law to which ordinary 18th and 19th century people had access and knew how to use. Now, their legal consciousness of ordinary people is not something I would ever have known or thought about without reading Woolley's diaries. But to return finally to the book project, to this, what ended up as this. I began writing the book about 4 years after I first encountered Woolley's diaries in Nottinghamshire archives. And as I've said, the story I tell is a very valiant attempt. I think it's a brave attempt to fill in the gaps and spaces of Joseph Woolley's writing. And it is, of course, also a story, as all historians' stories are, in dialogue with other historians about these years and these topics. The story of the Industrial Revolution, the Revolutionary and French and Napoleonic Wars, the story of the years 1800 to 1820 is a very different one from the story we had 20 years ago or 50 years ago, when Thompson wrote The Making of the English Working Class. An academic historian is always as much in dialogue with past and present historians as she is with her historical subjects, or with, in this case, Joseph Woolley. Transcription, I suppose, was my first and primary method. I've always transcribed in full any document I want to work on in detail. That means that I copied out in my own handwriting the words that Woolley put on the page. Now that's a very effective way of slowing yourself down as a reader to the pace at which the words were inscribed. What's more, this is the brilliance of transcription. It allows you to take part in the same material activity as your historical subject, using quite similar tools. His words, which came from his mind and were then deposited on the page of an old Moor's almanac, pass through your mind and get deposited on your own A4 writing pad. I always start in handwriting to get the feel of things. With an earlier book, the Radical Soldier's Memoirs, that was published in 1988, I think. I did the whole of his memoirs in handwriting, transcribed the whole of them in handwriting, because this was the 80s, pre-computer days, and the Radical Soldier's Memoirs were much shorter. They were only 6,000 words, as opposed to 100,000. I just thought I'd tell you I've been at this for a very long time. So handwriting at first, and then when I'm feeling confident, a running transcription of every word on my computer. When it was in place, months later, I could kind of organise it like that. That's a page from my basic transcription. And then I organised it so that it was fully searchable, annotated and dated down the side. And I use a WordPerfect, which is not horrible infantile word, which means you can search very easily. And so I suppose this is transcription several times over. It's worked over at least 3 times. And it makes you read so thoroughly for the spaces and absences, the intended ironies, the literary allusions. I would not have noticed Henry Fielding in this text if I hadn't transcribed. And you discard your earlier presumptions. You know, I originally thought that Woolley was a misogynist. You know, by the end of my transcription, I realised he was a writer who empathised with the difficulties of many women's lives, who noticed deeply unhappy sexual relationships and violent sexual relationships and recorded them, and who always wrote about women as if they were the same kind of creature as men. And someone read through the window of transcription just does become a writer. There becomes no other way you can relate to this person but as a writer, because you have written out every word they have written several times over. And the relationship you then begin to construct with the words is as a writer yourself. And by encountering Woolley as a writer, I also met him as a reader. I'm shortly about to finish. He recorded buying 22 books in the diary years, but he only named one of them, and that's Tom Jones. He bought 4 volumes, the 4-volume issue of Tom Jones. And there I read or reread all the literature that Woolley actually named. I reread Samuel Richardson's Pamela, published in 1740, which he borrowed from Sutton's library in 1801, with the elation of knowing that with Joseph Woolley we had actually found our first known working class reader of Richardson's blockbuster. 18th century commentators had always assumed that the story of a working class girl made good had a particular appeal for the lower orders, but of course they never met a lower class person who'd ever read it. But with Woolley we do meet one. He did. Well, I don't know that he read it. I only know that he borrowed it. The new history of publishing and print culture in Britain told me why these early 18th century novels, Fielding's, Richardson's novels, were so readily available to ordinary readers at the turn of the 19th century. There were big changes in copyright legislation in the 1770s, which made reprints of older literature very cheap. But that doesn't account for the modern novel Woolley borrowed from Sutton's. He borrowed The Monk, Matthew Lewis's The Monk. There were dozens of cheap and chapbook editions of Lewis's extraordinary 3-volume original of 1796. He published it. Dozens of cheap versions available by the end of the century. Lust, murder, incest, and every atrocity that can disgrace human nature, brought together without the apology of probability, made it totally unfit for general circulation, said one contemporary reviewer. A vein of obscenity pervades the whole, said another. But that didn't stop the printer booksellers of provincial England making it available to ordinary eager readers every which way. I reread the historians who have related pornography to political radicalism and tried to think through Joseph Woolley as that kind of reader, possibly, of his time and circumstance. From Woolley, I also discovered the immensely, I bet you've never heard of this, but it was immensely popular, Life of Baron Frederick Trenck, Trenck. It was first done into English in 1747, with a 3rd edition in 1800. I had never heard of it till I read Joseph Woolley about his borrowing it from Sutton's library, there were at least 9 imprints and translations of von Trenk's life published between 1747 and 1800 in the UK and in North America. Prussian, soldier, spy, adventurer, wine trader, lover, impregnator of a princess, mercenary, gambler, prisoner, writer. There's a kind of incredibly melancholy victimhood to Trenk's invented narrative. It's had a transatlantic audience since the mid-18th century. New historical work on masculinity suggests some of the ways in which Woolley may have read this story of masculine suffering. So, with the fiction Woolley borrowed and bought, there really is some evidence of what passed through his head. And I think, as I said, that it is an extraordinary and rare access to a mind and sensibility in the past. And I don't think I would have had access to it without transcribing every word and numeral that Woolley wrote. Now, Ned Ludd, whether cross-dressing or not, presented a much bigger methodological problem. His absence, the absence of Luddism from Woolley's writing, is the problem that endures. And as historians have to, I relied on context to say anything at all. In Kevin Binfield's work, which I've mentioned, I found a way of discussing the local circumstances, the working practices, the culture and the everyday life of thousands of unknown stocking makers and their families over a century or more as that which produced Luddism. That's essentially Binfield's argument, that a long cultural history produced Luddism in 1811, or more fancifully, gave birth to Ned Ludd. So I attempted to put in place a reconstruction of the culture that produced both Luddism and Joseph Woolley, or may have produced Joseph Woolley, that may have been the culture of the East Midlands hosiery trade. Now, I think it's best that we actually talk about this problem together now, Ned Ludd's absence, because I really have got to stop, I think. So I have stopped in rather an arbitrary way.